A summer storm crashed down on the highway near Yekaterinburg with relentless, almost primal force. The sky that only a few hours earlier had breathed pale calm light now became a heavy leaden dome hanging over the earth. Daylight faded, giving way to anxious twilight soaked in cold water. The city stayed far behind. Its concrete towers, wide avenues, and bustle dissolved into a hazy grey blur, leaving only a smudged grey memory. Rain poured in a solid wall, smashing against the wet asphalt of the federal highway with fury. This was no ordinary weather, it was an elemental force erasing the boundaries between the grey sky and the black road. Along the highway, raising giant columns of watery spray, heavy trucks streamed in an unbroken flow. Their low vibrating roar blended with the monotonous noise of the downpour, while the sound of tires greedily slicing through deep puddles created a deafening, unending symphony of road chaos. Right in the center of this watery hell, obediently following the curve of the road, an old, battle-scarred SUV moved slowly. Behind the wheel sat Thomas, a man in his early 40s whose face bore deep traces of harsh winters, piercing winds, and heavy life trials. Hard, deep wrinkles ran from the corners of his mouth like a frozen shadow of a long-forgotten smile that would never appear on his face again. His hair, touched by early ash gray, was cut short, and in his dark, incredibly tired eyes lay an endless emptiness. It was the gaze of a man who looked at the world around him but saw only his own deeply hidden memories. In the past, Thomas had been a mountain rescuer, a man of incredible endurance who again and again challenged the harshest peaks to save strangers' lives. But mountains always take their toll, and the price Thomas paid proved too high. He drove the SUV with no clear destination, not trying to get from one point to another. He drove simply to keep moving. Movement created a faint illusion of life and helped cheat time. The left side of his world was forever plunged into eternal, impenetrable silence. The damaged hearing had become a constant physical reminder of that fateful avalanche that split his life into before and after. Because of this deafness, sounds from the outside world reached him distorted, as if through a thick layer of water. The noise of the high-speed highway, the roar of powerful engines, the whistle of wind, and the drumming of heavy drops on the metal roof of the car did not form an ordinary melody of rain for him. To him they merged into a dense, suffocating wall of noise. That sound pressed on his temples, filled every space of the small cabin, and squeezed his chest so tightly that sometimes it became hard to breathe. Thomas suffered from severe post-traumatic stress, and this constant vibrating hum seemed to him a tangible enemy. He was trapped inside his own traumatized mind, in an isolation that no human voice, no comforting word, could pierce. Dozens of cars flashed past the SUV at incredible speed. People hurried about their affairs, safely hidden behind tinted windows in the warm, cozy interiors of their vehicles. For them, this powerful downpour was merely an annoying hindrance, a minor inconvenience on the way to a warm home or a dry office. None of them looked to the sides. Hundreds of vehicles merged into one faceless, indifferent stream of light and metal. Thomas watched them through the wet windshield, feeling like a disembodied ghost among living, pulsing lives. He was physically present here, gripping the worn leather steering wheel tightly, feeling the faint vibration of the running engine beneath his feet, yet his soul wandered somewhere very far away. It roamed among eternal snows, cold winds, and sharp stones, refusing to return to the real world. Somewhere ahead on the completely flooded shoulder, a dark, shapeless spot stood out. At first, Thomas's tired brain decided it was simply a piece of torn old tire thrown from a truck or a scrap of dirty tarpaulin. In such terrible weather, vision easily deceived even the most attentive drivers. Heavy semis roared past only a few yards from this motionless mass, drenching it with powerful waves of dirty, icy water from the asphalt. Not a single driver slowed down. Not one car flashed red brake lights. The flow continued its merciless mechanical movement forward, showing icy indifference to everything beyond the safety of their cabins. The world moved on, paying no attention to those left on the shoulder. As Thomas's old SUV drew inevitably closer, the dark mass began to take on definite shapes. The wipers worked at their limit, sweeping streams of water from the glass in feverish speed, but the rain still distorted and blurred the picture. Thomas had no intention of stopping. He had stopped intervening in the course of things long ago. His broken heart had hardened, covered with a thick, impenetrable crust of ice that protected it from any new pain. Why stop? Whom could he help in this world if he had failed to save his comrade from a terrible fate, if he had failed to save himself from slow destruction? He simply stared ahead with an empty gaze, waiting for the dark spot to flash past and disappear in the rearview mirror. But when the dim light of his headlights cut through the rainy gloom and illuminated that place, time for Thomas suddenly, frighteningly slowed. Space around him warped. The muffled noise of rain and the furious roar of passing trucks suddenly receded into the background, giving way to a ringing, tense silence inside his head. Beside the large wounded dark silhouette of the adult animal lying there, right at the edge of the slippery asphalt, was a tiny creature desperately clinging to life. It was a wolf pup, a small fluffy ball of white fur that Thomas would later name Blizzard. Right now the little one was soaked through, covered in mud and road grime. He seemed unimaginably small and defenseless against the merciless roaring highway. His fur was pathetically matted from the water, and his tiny body shook continuously with violent trembling. But what struck and stopped Thomas was not this pitiful sight. His gaze through the curtain of rain met the eyes of the wolf pup. They were incredibly wide open, filled with bottomless despair, terror, and a silent plea. The baby stood over the motionless broken body of his mother, stubbornly lifting his small head toward the indifferent iron giants rushing past. And in that very moment Thomas clearly saw the little wolf pup's mouth open wide. He was screaming. He was calling for help, pouring into that cry all his tiny fading strength, all his pain from the approaching loss. Yet through the deafening noise of the highway Thomas heard not a single sound. That desperate call was completely, utterly swallowed by the soulless roar of engines and the drumming of rain. This silent scream, this mouth opened wide in a frantic plea, suddenly made the SUV's windshield seem to crack and melt. The rain instantly turned into thick swirling snow. The grey wet asphalt vanished, replaced by a blinding white merciless mountain slope. Thomas's breath caught painfully. In his mind, with frightening destructive clarity, rose the face of his best friend and partner. The face of the man he had lost in that cursed expedition. In those last seconds stretched into eternity before the giant white wall of unstoppable snow buried them, his friend had looked at him exactly the same way. His eyes had been just as wide open in premonition of the inevitable. And he had been screaming. Screaming with all his might, trying to warn Thomas, trying to save him at the cost of his own life. But because of the monstrous roar of the avalanche, Thomas had not heard a single sound then. He had only seen that desperate movement of the lips, that silent scream that had haunted him every night for many long years, driving him mad with its silence. The visual image of the little white wolf pup screaming into emptiness beneath the cold pouring rain overlaid the image of his snow-buried friend with surgical precision. It was not simply a memory, it felt like a powerful physical blow. As if an invisible sledgehammer had struck Thomas right in the center of his chest with monstrous force. Air instantly left his lungs, leaving only a burning emptiness. His hands, clenched in a death grip on the leather steering wheel, turned white from the terrible tension. The heart he had so carefully laid behind walls of indifference and alienation missed a painful beat, froze for a second, then began pounding with frantic deafening speed. Pain, sharp guilt, and unbearable longing that had slept deep beneath the thickness of emotional ice suddenly burst out, crushing and breaking every psychological barrier he had built. He could not leave this baby to freeze in the mud. He simply could not allow a living creature to scream for help into indifferent emptiness a second time in his life and receive no answer. The reflexes of an experienced rescuer, dormant for years yet never completely gone, kicked in faster than any conscious thought in his concussed head. His right foot slammed the brake pedal to the floor. The heavy tires screeched loudly on the wet asphalt, desperately protesting the sudden stop at high speed. The heavy SUV fishtailed threateningly. Huge sprays of dirty water flew in a wide fan in every direction. The vehicle skidded uncontrollably toward the deep shoulder, but Thomas's strong trained hands made a confident quick correction, preventing a collision. The SUV jerked to a halt at the very edge of the slippery road, only a few yards from the injured she-wolf lying on the ground and the white pup screaming with his last strength. With a trembling hand, Thomas pressed the button on the panel and switched on the emergency flashes. Bright yellow flashes began rhythmically cutting through the grey rainy gloom like the pulsing heartbeat of a human soul returning to life. He sat like that for several long seconds, breathing heavily and hoarsely, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. The absolute dead silence inside him was finally broken. The silent scream of the tiny soaked creature proved louder than any destructive avalanche. Thomas resolutely opened the heavy car door and stepped out into the raging storm, ready once again to fight for someone's life. The SUV door did not yield at once. Thomas had to lean on it with all his weight to overcome the resistance of the gale-force wind. As soon as a gap appeared, the roar of the elements rushed into the cabin. Cold drops struck his face, burning his skin like tiny shards of ice. He took a deep breath, gathering his will into a fist, and stepped outside into the very heart of the raging storm. The emergency lane of the federal highway now resembled a churning river. Streams of murky water raced along the asphalt, carrying small debris and mud. Just a couple of yards from Thomas, heavy container trucks continued to roar past at enormous speed. Each passing semi created a powerful airwave and raised a wall of water that crashed onto the shoulder with force. The air trembled from the low hum of powerful diesel engines. In this chaos of sounds and motion, the man seemed infinitely small and vulnerable. Thomas moved slowly forward toward the dark silhouette. His boots stepped heavily on the waterlogged asphalt, slipping on the wet mud. With every step the picture became clearer and therefore even more piercing. On the very edge of the asphalt where the hard surface gave way to rain-soaked earth lay a large she-wolf. Later he would learn her name was Luna, but right now she was simply a desperate mother. Her thick, once beautiful grey fur was soaked through, darkened, and matted into heavy strands. On her hind thigh a serious wound gaped, the result of a glancing blow from the bumper of a passing heavy truck. Life forces were rapidly leaving her body together with warm blood. Severe hypothermia had already begun to take hold. Violent shivering shook her sides and her breathing was intermittent and hoarse. Yet even on the brink of complete exhaustion, Luna had not surrendered. She had curved her large body to create a living shield, sheltering in the curve of her belly the most precious thing she had. Two tiny fluffy bundles, one almost white, the other dark, pressing against her belly trying to warm themselves. They were too small to understand what was happening, but instinctively they felt that only their mother's warmth could save them from this merciless cold world. Thomas stopped a yard away and slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Water instantly soaked through the fabric of his trousers, burning his skin with cold, yet he did not even flinch. He extended his hand forward, palm up, to show he meant no harm. At that moment wild instinct overpowered weakness. Luna struggled to lift her heavy head. Her eyes, like two dulled amber stones, met the man's gaze. There was no plea in them. They burned with a primal, indomitable fire of protection. She bared sharp white fangs, and through the noise of the rain Thomas heard a low vibrating growl. It was weak, hoarse, broken from lack of strength, yet absolutely unmistakable. It was a clear boundary between the world of humans and the world of wild nature, a boundary whose crossing could cost both sides far too dearly. Thomas froze. He was an experienced rescuer and understood perfectly the psychology of cornered creatures. An adult wild animal in panic and pain, defending its offspring, was capable of one last desperate lunge. He could not simply pick her up. She would not allow him near, and her weight, considering the soaked fur, made the task impossible for one man without special equipment. Time was inexorably slipping away. With every minute spent on the cold asphalt under the pouring rain, the chances of the wolf family surviving dwindled rapidly. He had to act decisively, unconventionally, relying on experience and strength. Thomas slowly straightened up. Without taking his eyes off the wary she-wolf, he unzipped his heavy waterproof rescue poncho. As soon as he shrugged it off his shoulders, the icy wind and lashing rain crashed onto his sweater. Cold pierced his body to the bones, making his muscles reflexively contract, yet his mind remained crystal clear. He gripped the heavy rubberized fabric of the poncho firmly with both hands. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped sharply forward and with a precise calculated motion threw the poncho directly over Luna's head and torso. The dense fabric instantly hid the frightening surrounding world from the she-wolf. Sudden darkness and weight disoriented the animal. The growl choked off, replaced by a short muffled gasp. It was an old rescue tactic. Deprive a panicked animal of visual stimuli to suppress aggression and prevent resistance. Without losing a second, Thomas bent down, seized the edges of the poncho, forming something like a sturdy sack or drag, and pulled with all his strength. The weight was colossal. The soaked body of the large predator, multiplied by the resistance of sticky mud and wet asphalt, seemed immovable. Thomas clenched his teeth so tightly that the muscles in his jaw bulged. The muscles of his back and arms strained to the limit. Fibers seemed to burn with fire beneath the soaked clothing. He took one heavy step backward, then another. His boots slipped, finding no firm footing, yet he continued to pull. Only a few yards remained to the rear gate of his pickup equipped with a covered camper shell. Those yards felt like the longest distance in his life. He pulled stubbornly, rhythmically, in time with his ragged breathing. Luna inside the poncho hardly resisted. Exhaustion and shock had done their work. Finally, Thomas drew level with the vehicle. He dropped the tailgate, gathered the last crumbs of his physical strength, and with a muffled roar that tore from his very chest, he lifted the makeshift stretcher and slid the heavy body wrapped in the poncho into the dark depths of the cargo bed. Breathing out loudly, Thomas leaned on the tailgate with trembling hands. Rain poured down his face, washing away sweat, but the job was only half done. Thomas's gaze darted back to where Luna had just lain. Left without their mother's warm side and suddenly exposed to the direct blows of the cold downpour, the two wolf pups whimpered pitifully. The white baby, clumsily scrambling with splayed paws, took his first step through the puddles in the direction where his mother had been dragged. The dark brother followed unsteadily, swaying from gusts of wind. They were so defenseless before the huge world that Thomas's heart clenched with pain. Suddenly, through the noise of the rain, a new threatening growing sound broke in. The road surface trembled faintly. Thomas jerked his head around. Straight toward them, without slowing, a huge semi-trailer emerged from the rainy haze. The driver had probably noticed the activity on the shoulder too late and was now desperately blasting the air horn. The low vibrating roar tore the air. The multi-ton monster could not swerve into the left lane because of the dense traffic and was hurtling straight along the edge of the lane, raising a gigantic wave of water from the deep rut. Seconds counted now. Thomas pushed off the tailgate and leaped forward. He did not run, he literally threw himself onto the wet asphalt, stretching out his arms. His fingers sank into the wet fur of the two tiny creatures. He scooped them into his arms, pressing them to his chest, and with a powerful thrust of his legs hurled his body backward toward the saving metal of his vehicle. The impact of his back against the tailgate coincided with the deafening roar of the passing semi. The huge iron side flashed only a few dozen centimeters from Thomas's face. In the same instant, a wall of dirty icy water crashed with incredible force onto the very spot where the wolf pups and he himself had stood a moment earlier. The wave drenched the SUV and struck Thomas's legs, but he held firm, clutching the two trembling bundles of life tightly to himself. Breathing hard, he looked down. Blizzard and mist pressed fearfully against his sweater, seeking protection. Thomas lifted them and carefully, trying not to cause pain, lowered them deep into the cargo bed closer to their mother wrapped in the poncho. Then he slammed the tailgate shut. Left alone under the pouring rain, he leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the vehicle. For the first time in many years, he felt real pulsing life coursing through his veins. The heavy SUV slowly turned off the asphalt highway, leaving behind the deafening roar of trucks rushing through the storm. Thomas steered the vehicle onto a barely visible washed-out dirt road that led away from civilization. A few hundred yards later, through the dense curtain of rain, the indistinct outlines of an old, long-abandoned roadside service station emerged. It was a low concrete building with peeling paint and rusty gates, partially swallowed by the advancing forest. Thomas killed the engine. In the relative silence that followed, the sound of the downpour became clearly audible. Heavy drops drummed rhythmically on the tin roof of the station, creating a dull, monotonous melody. That sound no longer pressed on his ears. On the contrary, it seemed a protective barrier cutting them off from the merciless world of the highway. The man quickly got out, opened the camper shell, and carefully lifted the heavy bundle of the rescue poncho containing the heavily breathing she-wolf. The two tiny pups, shivering with cold, trotted behind his wet boots while he looked for shelter. Inside, the station smelled of stale dampness, wet dust, and long-dried machine oil. The room was sunk in semi-darkness. Only a dim grey light filtered through narrow, dirty windows. Thomas cautiously lowered his burden onto the driest section of the concrete floor away from drafts. He folded back the edge of the poncho. Luna lay motionless. The injury on her thigh looked frightening. The deep cut received from the blow of heavy metal continued to drain the animal's life forces. If the bleeding was not stopped immediately, Luna would not live until morning. Her exhaustion had reached a critical point. Thomas began feverishly searching the abandoned building. His trained eye picked out useful items among the junk. In the far corner, he found a stack of old dusty but dry canvas tarps and several rubberized mats. Grabbing them, he quickly built an improvised nest protected from the cold concrete and carefully transferred Luna there. The pups immediately dived under the protective top, pressing against their mother's cooling side. Suddenly, there was a long metallic creak. The heavy entrance door slowly opened, letting in a gust of icy wind and a fresh spray of raindrops. Thomas instantly tensed, instinctively shielding the makeshift wolf bed with his body. On the threshold stood a man. It was an elderly man dressed in a faded reflective vest over a thick work jacket. Streams of water ran from the hood pulled low over his forehead. The stranger turned out to be Robert, a long-time road service worker who in this foul weather was making a scheduled inspection of clogged storm drains. Robert's face resembled an old geographical map. It was crisscrossed with deep wrinkles from many years of work under scorching sun and piercing wind. His thick grey eyebrows hung over his eyes, yet his gaze itself was surprisingly bright, calm, and wise. Robert shook water from his shoulders and looked deeper into the dark garage. He saw the tense, soaked man and noticed the grey fur of the large predator on the top. Any other person in his place would have panicked and fled or called an armed patrol. But the old road worker merely sighed heavily. In his eyes there was not a drop of fear or hostility, only a deep understanding of life's harsh truth. He nodded silently to Thomas, turned, and walked back out into the rain. Thomas remained in bewilderment, but there was no time for reflection. Luna was getting worse. Yet less than 5 minutes later the door creaked again. Robert returned. In one hand he carried a large metal thermos from which blessed warmth emanated, and in the other a massive field medical bag of olive color. The old man approached, set his treasures on an overturned wooden crate, and clicked on a powerful handheld flashlight, directing the beam at the wounded animal. "Here you go, son," he said in a hoarse, raspy voice while pouring hot water into the thermos lid. "First warm yourself or your hands will shake. In our line of work a steady hand is everything." Thomas accepted the scalding cup with gratitude. After a sip he felt warmth slowly spreading through his frozen body, returning sensation to his numb fingers. He opened Robert's medical bag. Inside was everything necessary: bandages, antiseptics, surgical needles, and sterile thread. It was the kit of a man who had faced harsh trials on isolated stretches of road many times. Under the dim but saving beam of the flashlight that the old worker patiently held, the instincts of the professional rescuer fully awakened in Thomas. The world narrowed to the size of the wounded she-wolf's thigh. The sound of rain on the roof turned into a steady metronome counting seconds. Thomas generously soaked a gauze pad with medical alcohol. "Easy, girl, hold on," he said softly, almost in a whisper, addressing Luna. When the antiseptic touched the wound, the she-wolf shuddered weakly and gave a quiet, pitiful whimper. The white pup Blizzard anxiously poked his nose from under the top, but Thomas gently pushed him aside with his elbow. Luna made no attempt to bite the man. With her deep intuitive sense as a wild beast, she understood that this pain brought healing. She relaxed her muscles and laid her heavy head on her paws, fully trusting the rescuer's hands. Thomas's movements became incredibly precise, rapid, and measured. He threaded strong medical suture into the eye of a curved surgical needle. Every gesture was honed by years of work in extreme conditions. The first stitch drew the edges of the deep cut together, then the second, then the third. Thomas worked in complete silence, fully focused on the task. In those minutes he was no longer a broken man with damaged hearing. He had become once again what he had been born to be: a guardian of life. Robert watched the scene with hidden respect. He saw how confidently the stranger's hands laid an even professional suture, closing the vulnerable spot and stopping the loss of strength. When the final knot was securely tied, Thomas generously treated the stitched area with healing ointment and applied a tight, neat dressing of sterile bandages. The work was finished. Thomas exhaled heavily, feeling the tension slowly leave his shoulders. He carefully adjusted the warm top, covering Luna up to her neck. The pups, sensing the danger had passed, began to stir joyfully in their shelter and pressed against their mother's bandaged side. Luna took a deep breath and her intermittent breathing finally became even and calm. She fell asleep. Old Robert lowered the flashlight. The beam of light slid across Thomas's tired, pale, yet peaceful face. The old man took a clean rag from his pocket and handed it to the rescuer so he could wipe his hands. Robert looked at the peacefully sleeping family, then shifted his gaze to Thomas. Kind wrinkles gathered at the corners of the old worker's eyes. "You just stitched her life back together," he said quietly but firmly. The old man's voice echoed off the concrete walls of the empty garage. "On this high-speed highway there has long been no room for humanity. Only metal, speed, and indifference. But fortunately for this family, you still have that humanity." Thomas said nothing in reply. He simply looked at the sleeping wolves, listening to the drumming of rain on the roof, and for the first time in a long while felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Late evening crept up on the old abandoned service station with soft steps. The furious summer storm that had only recently tormented the federal highway and turned the world into a grey roaring chaos finally exhaled its last breath. Now only a fine monotonous drizzle fell from the darkened sky. Its quiet rhythmic rustle on the tin roof of the garage acted soothingly, like a lullaby whispered by nature itself. Inside the spacious concrete room, the atmosphere had imperceptibly changed. The oppressive feeling of approaching death, that icy cold of hopelessness that Thomas had brought with him from the roadside, had dissolved without a trace. The air still smelled of dampness, old machine oil, and wet dust, yet now a new warm note had appeared. The scent of saved life. Thomas sat on an overturned wooden crate, leaning his back against the rough wall. He stretched out his tired legs that ached from tension and allowed himself simply to breathe. Old Robert had left quietly, leaving behind not only the field medical kit and the thermos of hot tea, but also a strange feeling of restored faith in people. Thomas's gaze was fixed on the improvised nest of old canvas tarps. Thanks to timely professional help and preserved warmth, Luna had safely passed the critical line. Her large, strong body no longer shook with violent chills of hypothermia. The she-wolf's breathing, intermittent and hoarse an hour earlier, had evened out and become deep and calm. Her chest rose and fell rhythmically in time with the quiet noise of rain. Medicine and exhaustion had plunged her into a deep healing sleep. The suture on her thigh remained dry. The tight bandage reliably protected the wound. Life that had threatened to end on the cold asphalt now pulsed confidently in her veins. While their mother slept, gathering strength, the two tiny fluffy bundles began to show the first signs of restlessness. The long time spent in warmth under the dense fabric had done its work. Their thin fur, matted from the icy rain and mud, had finally dried. Now they no longer resembled pathetic drowning mice. Fluffed up, they had turned into two adorable round balls of fur radiating incredible primal energy. First, a wet, curious black nose poked out from under the edge of the top, actively sniffing the unfamiliar smells of the garage. Thomas held his breath, watching the process. Soon the first wolf pup emerged timidly but persistently. It was the baby with dazzling white fur on which only faint smoky markings showed here and there. Despite his tiny size and clumsy paws, he held himself with surprising confidence. The white pup took several unsteady steps, stretched comically arching his hind legs, and yawned widely, revealing tiny but already needle-sharp teeth. Much more cautiously the second pup appeared after him. His fur was a deep dark, almost coal-black with silvery glints. Unlike his bold brother, the dark pup did not hurry to leave the safe shelter. He poked halfway out from under the top, pressing his whole body against the sleeping mother and warily looking around with big intelligent eyes. Every rustle made him flinch and hide back in the shadows. Thomas watched them, and something strange began to happen inside his soul, long frozen by the ice of post-traumatic stress. He caught himself thinking that these two tiny creatures were the perfect reflection of the world's duality, and perhaps a reflection of himself. "You will be Blizzard," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, looking at the white pup who had already moved a yard from his mother and was curiously sniffing an old nut on the floor. Just as fearless, stubborn, and swift. A real white blizzard that fears no storm. Then his gaze shifted to the second, more cautious baby. "And you will be missed." Thomas's voice grew even softer. Quiet, unnoticeable, hiding in the shadows. The one who is always careful. Blizzard and Mist. The names slipped from his lips easily and naturally, as if they had always belonged to these animals. For the first time in a very long while, Thomas was speaking aloud to someone not out of necessity, not issuing short dry commands, but simply from the desire to share warmth. Meanwhile Blizzard, having fully settled into the new environment, decided to expand the territory of his explorations. His small claws clicked amusingly on the concrete floor. He moved in funny bouncing steps typical of all pups his age when the body still poorly obeys the brain's commands. In the corner not far from where Thomas sat lay an old massive glass headlight lens from a heavy Soviet truck. It was thick, incredibly durable, and smooth. Exactly this gleaming object in the semi-darkness attracted the white explorer. Blizzard approached the glass hemisphere, tilted his head to one side, and carefully sniffed it. The smell of dust made him sneeze comically. Then, growing bolder, he decided to test the strange object with his teeth. The pup opened his small mouth wide and tried to bite the smooth surface. Naturally the teeth slipped, and from the light push the round headlight rolled across the uneven concrete floor with a humming sound. This unexpected movement sent Blizzard into complete delight and at the same time frightened him a little. He jumped back, comically spreading his front paws, and growled in a thin squeaky voice, trying to intimidate the living toy. Convinced that the headlight was no longer moving, he rushed to attack again. This time he miscalculated his speed on the concrete slippery from spilled oil long ago. His little paws splayed in different directions. Blizzard lost his balance, tumbled head over heels, and rolling across the floor like a fluffy ball crashed at full speed straight into Thomas's heavy boot covered with dried mud. The collision was soft but unexpected. The pup shook his head as if trying to come to his senses after the unsuccessful maneuver, then raised his gaze upward at the huge man towering over him. Instead of being frightened or running back to his mother, Blizzard sat on his hind legs, lifted his little muzzle, and barked indignantly. It was a ringing, abrupt yip 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 in which puppy offense at the obstacle blocking his path mixed with demanding carefree confidence that the whole world should yield to him. He yipped, shifting from paw to paw, his tiny fluffy appearance demonstrating extreme indignation at the behavior of this huge motionless boot. Thomas looked at this tiny ball of pure sincere pulsing energy trying to scold his boot. And suddenly something inside him stirred. Deep in his chest, long squeezed by invisible vices of guilt, pain, and grief, a new long-forgotten feeling was born. It rose upward, tickling his throat, displacing the dull, aching emptiness. Thomas's lips, accustomed only to a severe tense line, twitched and slowly stretched. From his chest came a sound. At first it was a quiet hoarse chuckle of a man who had forgotten how to do this. But Blizzard, hearing the sound, yipped even louder and comically tapped the boot with his front paw. And then Thomas laughed. It was a real loud, deep laugh. Ringing and clear, it echoed off the damp concrete walls of the abandoned garage. The laughter filled every space, displacing the noise of rain, the smell of old oil, and the dark shadows of the past. Thomas laughed, throwing his head back, feeling how together with this sound the thick icy wall that had surrounded his heart for the last 5 years was crumbling. His damaged hearing, which usually caught only irritating hum and phantom screams of the past, now perceived this moment clearly, without the slightest distortion. The ringing absurd barking of the little wolf pup and his own sincere laughter merged into one healing melody. Mist, hearing the noise, poked his head out from under the top with curiosity, tilting it to one side. Luna sighed deeply and calmly in her sleep, paying no attention to the commotion. And Thomas continued to sit on the crate, looking at Blizzard while his shoulders shook slightly with laughter. For the first time in endlessly long time he was not fleeing memories and not hiding from sounds. In this cold godforsaken garage, thanks to the tiny white wolf pup, Thomas felt alive again. And this simple naive spark of life proved stronger than any approaching darkness. The short bright respite that had given Thomas his first sincere laugh in many years turned out to be only a deceptive lull. Nature, as if deciding to test them to the limit, was preparing a new blow. Toward evening the light drizzle suddenly stopped. The air in the old abandoned garage grew thick, almost tangible, filled with an anxious smell of ozone and damp concrete dust. Outside the wind sharply changed direction, turning into a low prolonged howl that moaned in the cracks of the rusty metal gates. The world beyond the walls plunged into darkness and then the sky split in two. A blinding branched flash of lightning sliced the darkness for a fraction of a second, illuminating the huge room with deathly pale cold light and casting long distorted shadows on the walls. An instant later a monstrous deafening clap of thunder crashed onto the tin roof with such primal force that the entire building shuddered to its foundations. The vibration passed through the concrete floor, echoing in the legs. For an ordinary person it was simply very loud thunder, a natural phenomenon. But for Thomas's damaged hearing and deeply traumatized psyche this sound had nothing in common with a summer storm. The specific purity and powerful acoustic wave became the very fatal key that with merciless force broke open the door to his personal long-locked hell. The low-frequency hum multiplied many times in his concussed head, distorting, refracting, and turning into a completely different sound. It was the heavy, inexorable rumble of shifting multi-ton ice plates, the sound of approaching white death. The garage walls instantly dissolved, disappeared into darkness. The specific smell of machine oil and old canvas tarps was replaced in his inflamed perception by the sharp burning smell of ice dust and rarefied mountain air. Thomas was no longer in a safe shelter. He stood once again on the cursed steep slope of the Ural Mountains. Before his inner eye, brighter than any lightning, rose the face of Paul. Paul had been his young partner in the rescue team. He was a youth full of inexhaustible vital energy, enthusiasm, and bright hopes, with bright, always laughing blue eyes. A man Thomas had trusted as himself. On that fateful day when the mountain decided to take its due, Paul had been a little lower on the slope. Thomas remembered that terrible deafening crack of the tearing snow slab. He remembered how Paul's blue eyes had widened in full awareness of the inevitable cry a second before the giant merciless white wave forever swallowed him, snapping the safety rope like a thin thread. Thomas staggered backward, stumbling in the darkness, until his back struck the cold rough wall in the farthest corner of the room with a dull thud. He slowly slid helplessly to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest and desperately, until his knuckles whitened, clutching his head with his hands. A full-scale panic attack had begun. The psychological collapse was swift and devastating. Thomas was suffocating. The air seemed dense and heavy like packed wet snow clogging his nose and mouth. His broad chest heaved in convulsive jerks trying to catch at least a drop of oxygen that, it seemed, no longer existed. An invisible phantom avalanche again and again covered him with its head, burying him alive in the icy captivity of cruel memory. He shook so violently that his teeth chattered in an uncontrollable rattle and cold sweat poured down his face in streams. He moaned through clenched teeth, trying to drown out the roar. In that second he was absolutely alone in the whole universe, alone in the ringing killing emptiness of his unforgiven past. But through the veil of suffocating panic, through the deafening hum of his own wildly beating heart, Thomas could not hear how in the other end of the garage the old top stirred. Luna had awakened at the first clap of thunder. Wild animals do not like storms. Their instincts demand deep shelter. But the attentive she-wolf's attention was drawn to something else entirely. Her keen, perfect sense of smell instantly caught the sharp, sour smell of human fear and the colossal surge of adrenaline that in one instant filled the garage space. She struggled to raise her heavy head. In the light of another lightning flash, her amber eyes unerringly found the silhouette of the man who that day had saved her life at risk to himself on the highway and later had carefully stitched her wounds. Now this strong man sat in the darkest corner, curled into a pitiful ball, and looked incredibly vulnerable like an injured cub. The instinct of the pack, the ancient feeling of deep attachment and duty to the one who had become their protector, proved in that moment far stronger than physical pain. Luna made an incredible effort over herself. Leaning mostly on her healthy muscular front paws, she slowly left her warm nest. Breathing heavily, she began to drag her bandaged, aching hindquarters, crawling onto the cold concrete. Every inch gained cost her enormous effort. The fresh suture pulled, muscles burned with fire. Yet the she-wolf stubbornly, without making a sound, crawled forward. Thomas noticed nothing, completely absorbed in his nightmare, until suddenly he felt something large, incredibly warm, and heavy softly settle beside him. Luna had with difficulty lain down close to him, pressing her massive fluffy side tightly against his shuddering back. She stretched her neck and with a deep calming sigh laid her large head right on his shoulder. Through the damp fabric of his rough sweater Thomas suddenly felt something astonishing. It was not the burning cold of dead snow. It was life itself. The mighty, even imperturbably calm beating of the huge wolf heart transferred to his body. This primal warmth began rhythmically counting the seconds of real time, breaking through the chaos of his thoughts. Thump thump, thump thump. Sensing their mother's movement and catching the alarm in the air, the two small fluffy bundles also did not stay aside. Blizzard and Mist, stumbling in the darkness and whimpering softly, trotted across the entire garage. Reaching the corner, they literally wormed their way into the narrow space between Thomas's trembling arms and chest. Small wet warm noses insistently poked into his palms. Their soft rough tongues began with incredible tenderness to lick the cold sweat from his wrists. Thomas took a convulsive deep breath. The natural smell of damp pine, wet fur, and warm milk coming from the pups instantly displaced the illusory dead smell of ozone and mountain ice. The wild primal biological energy of this small pack seemed to wrap his falling consciousness with invisible but indestructible ropes and with incredible soft force pulled him back to the surface, into here and now. The man's hands that had been clutching his head in a death grip slowly relaxed and lowered. He hesitantly, as if afraid the vision would disappear, embraced the little wolf pups. Thomas buried his face in their soft fur smelling of rain while Luna continued to warm his back reliably. She created a living impenetrable shield between his wounded soul and the storm raging outside. His intermittent breathing gradually began to synchronize with the she-wolf's even deep breathing. The panic attack retreated, dissolving into the darkness of the garage like morning mist under the rays of the sun. Another even more powerful clap of thunder rumbled directly overhead, shaking the walls. But this time Thomas did not even flinch. The illusion finally dissipated. It was simply thunder, simply a summer storm over the Urals. In the darkest damp corner of the abandoned station, a man and 3 wild wolves sat on the cold floor, pressed tightly against one another, forming an inseparable whole. And in this sacred silent unity of 2 worlds Thomas finally found what he had unsuccessfully sought all those long agonizing years. He gained an anchor that with its unconditional love and warmth forever held him in the world of the living. Morning arrived unnoticed, bringing long-awaited silence. The storm that had furiously tormented the earth all night finally exhausted its strength and departed beyond the horizon, leaving behind only a clean-washed sky. The rain had stopped completely. The ground around the old abandoned station was covered with deep puddles in which the timid pale light of the waking sun was reflected. Through wide gaps in the rusty metal gates, thin golden rays pierced into the garage, cutting through the damp cool air and illuminating dancing dust motes. Thomas opened his eyes. He lay on the old top, leaning his back against the wall. And for the first time in 5 long years, his awakening was not accompanied by a sticky feeling of anxiety. The suffocating hum in his ears that usually pursued him every morning now seemed distant and almost unnoticeable. The night storm had carried away not only fears but also the heavy veil that had hidden the real world from him. The man slowly shifted his gaze to his night rescuers. Luna lay nearby. Her breathing was even and deep. The bandage on her thigh remained clean. The wound no longer troubled the animal as strongly as yesterday. Sleep had restored part of her strength. Blizzard and Mist had already awakened and were quietly fussing near their mother. The white Blizzard, with his usual curiosity, tried to catch with his paw a slipping sunbeam gliding across the concrete floor, while the cautious Mist watched his brother attentively without straying far from the warm maternal side. This peaceful, almost domestic picture made Thomas smile faintly. He rose carefully to his feet, trying not to disturb the sleeping she-wolf, and stretched, loosening stiff muscles. He needed to think through the next plan of action. Leaving wild animals near a busy highway was impossible. It contradicted all rules of common sense. Suddenly the silence of early morning was broken by the growing hum of a car engine. The sound approached from the exit ramp of the highway. Thomas tensed. A moment later came the crunch of gravel under heavy tires, and the engine noise died right in front of the station gates. A car door slammed. Heavy, confident footsteps splashed through the puddles. The wide gates creaked open, letting in a portion of fresh morning air and bright light. A man appeared on the threshold. It was Alex, an inspector from the Wild Animal Control Service, a tall, solidly built man of middle age with a stern, weather-beaten face and a piercing, strict gaze. He wore a uniform jacket with the emblem of the Ecological Patrol. His entire posture betrayed a man of unyielding character, accustomed to strictly following protocols and rules. A man who daily faced the consequences of human carelessness toward nature. Alex was making a scheduled round of the controlled territory after the strong storm, checking the condition of protective fences along the highway. Noticing the unusually parked pickup beside the abandoned building, he had decided to conduct an inspection. The inspector took several steps deeper into the room. His eyes, accustomed to semi-darkness, quickly assessed the situation. He saw the tall, tired man, and then his gaze unerringly stopped on the canvas bedding. Alex instantly recognized in the lying animal a large forest she-wolf, and beside her 2 cubs. Alex's face became even stricter. The instructions of the control service were perfectly clear. Wild predators, especially injured ones with offspring, posed a potential risk near roads and human communications. They were to be immediately isolated and transported to a specialized center. "Good morning." Alex's voice sounded cold and official, echoing off the concrete walls. "Animal Control Service. You understand that the presence of wild predators in this zone is strictly prohibited by regulations." Thomas stepped forward, instinctively shielding the animals with his body. "She is injured," he answered calmly but firmly. "She needed help. I simply sheltered them from the storm." Alex shook his head without changing his impenetrable expression. He was accustomed to such excuses. People often interfered in the natural course of things without understanding possible consequences. The inspector slowly, without sudden movements, unfastened the flap on his belt and took out a pneumatic injector. A specialized device for humane and safe sedation of animals with a tranquilizer. "For safety reasons, I am obliged to temporarily sedate the adult specimen and remove the litter for transfer to the isolation facility," Alex said in an even tone, raising the injector. "Please step aside. This is standard procedure." The atmosphere in the garage instantly grew tense. The air seemed to ring with strain. Hearing the unfamiliar voice and sensing the change in people's behavior, Luna awakened. Her maternal instinct worked like lightning. Overcoming weakness, the she-wolf rose heavily to her paws. She did not issue a loud growl, only a quiet warning rumble, bearing white fangs. But the most astonishing thing was different. Instead of instinctively rushing forward to defend her territory and cubs, Luna took a step back. She pressed her warm side tightly against Thomas's leg as if seeking protection from him and at the same time offering her own support. The two little wolf pups Blizzard and Mist squeaked in fright and instantly hid behind the man's broad back. In that moment, an invisible but absolutely indestructible bond formed between the wild beast and the man. They became a single whole, a small pack ready to stand up for one another to the end. Thomas did not move from his place. He straightened to his full considerable height, squared his shoulders, and resolutely stepped forward, completely covering the rescued family with his body. His gaze fixed on the inspector was calm, yet in it read such unshakable determination before which any instructions faded. Alex stopped. His finger lay on the trigger of the injector, but he hesitated. The inspector's gaze slid over Thomas's figure and suddenly caught on a detail he had not noticed immediately in the semi-darkness. On Thomas's worn, thoroughly soaked jacket in the chest area, an old half-torn fabric patch was visible. The colors on it had long faded and the edges were frayed from time and harsh trials. But Alex's experienced eye easily read the embroidered words, Mountain Rescue Unit. Beside it shone a faded emblem of the Emergency Response Service. The inspector froze, slowly realizing what was happening. Before him stood no casual tourist, no irresponsible lover of exotics playing rescuer. Before him stood a professional, a man who for years had risked his own life to save others in the most unbearable conditions. Alex knew such people. He knew their inner code, their boundless respect for life in all its manifestations, and their unyielding will. Moreover, Alex, as a specialist in animal behavior, perfectly understood the language of the she-wolf's body. The fact that Luna showed no uncontrolled aggression but sought protection from the man was phenomenal. It meant absolute unconditional trust. Any sharp action on his part now would not only violate this unique bond but also cause deep stress to the animals, something his profession required him to avoid at any cost. The silence in the garage became almost tangible. Only the rapid breathing of the pups and the measured sound of water drops falling from the roof into puddles could be heard. Alex's face gradually softened. The stern wrinkles on his forehead smoothed. He shifted his gaze from the chevron to Thomas's calm eyes and then to the she-wolf standing stubbornly at his feet. Tough, Alex sighed with sincere understanding. The inspector slowly lowered the injector and then with a confident motion returned it to the holster on his belt. The tension that had gripped the space instantly dissipated like morning mist under warm sun rays. Former rescuer, Alex asked quietly with a note of respect in his voice. Thomas gave a barely noticeable nod without taking his eyes off the inspector. Alex ran a hand over his face, brushing away accumulated fatigue, and looked at the brightening sky beyond the door. Listen, his voice lost its official coldness and became human and simple. I will close my eyes to this. Write in the report that I checked the abandoned building and found no one. But you must understand the measure of responsibility. Alex took a step toward the exit, then turned and looked Thomas straight in the eyes. Keep them on a short leash while they are with you. Take care of them the way you are used to taking care of people. Make sure they cause no one any trouble, otherwise by duty I will have to return, and I would really rather not. Thomas nodded shortly with deep gratitude. Thank you. I understand. They will disturb no one. The inspector smiled faintly at the corners of his mouth, saluted in farewell, and left the garage. Soon the sound of the departing patrol car dissolved in the morning air, carrying away the last threat from the outside world. Thomas dropped to one knee and affectionately yet confidently ran his hand over Luna's thick fur. The she-wolf gratefully closed her eyes while Blizzard and Mist immediately began wagging their tails joyfully, sensing that all worries were left behind. The light of the new day completely filled the garage. Thomas looked at his charges and realized it was time to return not simply to some random shelter but home, to the place that had stood empty for many years waiting for warmth. Now he had someone for whom to open the locked doors. The heavy SUV slowly turned off the asphalt highway, leaving behind the endless stream of cars, noise, and bustle. The wide road gave way to a narrow winding dirt track leading deep into the heart of the Russian rural backwoods. Here time flowed differently. The landscape beyond the window imperceptibly changed as if by the wave of a magic wand nature had dressed in its most luxurious solemn attire. That transparent ringing golden autumn had arrived which gives the soul an inexplicable feeling of peace and light sadness. On both sides of the road stood tall slender birches. Their snow-white trunks contrasted brightly with the lush crowns whose foliage shimmered in all shades of yellow, copper, and orange. A light breeze tore golden leaves and they swirled in the air, smoothly settling on the windshield and hood of the car. The air rushing through the open window was crystal clear, filled with aromas of fading grass, damp earth, and tree bark. Thomas drove calmly, unhurriedly. His hands lay confidently and softly on the steering wheel. He cast a short glance in the rearview mirror. On the spacious rear seat covered with a warm blanket, Luna slept peacefully. Her breathing was even and her posture expressed complete unconditional trust in the man who was taking her into the unknown. Blizzard and Mist, curled into cozy balls, slept at her side. Looking at this picture, Thomas finally understood that his long, exhausting years of running from himself had come to an end. He no longer needed to hide from memories in empty spaces and random shelters. The time had come to return home. Soon between the thinning trees a small wooden house appeared. It was a classic village log cabin, sturdy but long abandoned. It stood on the edge of the forest surrounded by thick thickets of wormwood and tall autumn grass. The wooden shutters were tightly closed, the porch slightly askew, and the chimney on the roof had long seen no smoke. This house for many years had served Thomas as nothing more than a physical shelter, a cold box in which he hid his pain. It had been an exact reflection of his inner state. Dark, locked with all bolts, deprived of light and warmth. Thomas killed the engine. The silence that descended on the clearing was not frightening but deep and natural. He got out of the car, approached the porch, and turned the heavy key in the rusty lock. The door yielded with a prolonged creak. Inside hung a stuffy, heavy smell of dust, old wood, and many years of loneliness. In the semi-darkness, the outlines of simple furniture covered with grey covers could be guessed. The man did not linger in the doorway. He took off his jacket and resolutely walked deeper into the room and threw open the heavy wooden shutters. Then with effort he opened the window sashes. Fresh autumn wind rushed inside with joyful rustling, driving out the stagnant air. Warm, generous rays of afternoon sun followed the wind into the room. They cut through the semi-darkness in golden pillars, illuminating dancing dust motes and sliding along the wooden floorboards, returning color and texture to them. The house seemed to take a deep, liberating breath. Returning to the car, Thomas carefully helped Luna descend. The she-wolf stepped cautiously on her sore paw and entered the house. She stopped in the middle of the room, attentively sniffing the unfamiliar smells. Her keen nose caught aromas of wood, dry herbs, and human presence. Realizing it was safe here, she slowly approached the wall and with dignity lay down on a large woven rug, stretching out her paws. Her amber eyes attentively followed every movement of Thomas, yet there was not a drop of anxiety in them. Wild, free nature had crossed the threshold of a human dwelling, bringing with it primal harmony. After their mother, the pups tumbled into the house with joyful yipping. For them, this new space was a whole world full of unsolved mysteries. While Luna preferred rest, the pups were full of inexhaustible energy. Blizzard immediately discovered the edge of an old rolled-up carpet in the corner of the room. Deciding it was an excellent opponent, he attacked the protruding fringe with a growl, comically shaking his head. Mist watched his brother for a second, then joined the game. They arranged a merry, noisy romp, tumbling across the wooden floor, leaping on each other, and tangling in the old fabric. Their ringing, carefree yipping brought the silent walls to life, erasing the last traces of former gloom. Thomas watched their play with a light smile on his lips. Then he turned to the center of the room where the heart of any village house stood. A large brick stove with an open hearth. It stood cold and indifferent. Its mouth was filled with grey long-cooled ash, a symbol of extinguished life and frozen time. The man knelt before the hearth. He took a metal shovel and began methodically, with some special solemnity, to scoop out the layer of old ashes. This simple household action acquired a deep symbolic meaning for him. With every sweep of the shovel, he seemed to rake out of his soul the remnants of past grievances, regrets, and painful memories. He was freeing space for something new, pure, and bright. Having finished cleaning, Thomas brought an armful of dry resinous birch logs from the woodshed. He neatly, skillfully stacked them in a house shape, adding thin twigs and dry birch bark to the base. A match struck. A small timid flame leaped onto the bark, crackled merrily, and began quickly rising upward, embracing the logs. Soon a bright hot fire danced merrily in the hearth. The fire illuminated the room with soft warm orange light, finally driving shadows from the corners. The sound of crackling logs filled the house with coziness, creating an inimitable melody of calm. While the fire blazed, Thomas hung a cast-iron cauldron of water over the hearth and threw in chopped vegetables and a little grain. After some time, the space filled with a thick, homely, incredibly tasty aroma of hot soup. That smell mixed with the scent of birch logs, creating the very atmosphere that cannot be faked. Evening arrived. Twilight thickened outside the windows, but inside the house it was light and warm. The pups, having played enough with the carpet and spent all their strength, crawled to the hearth. They curled into cozy fluffy balls right at Thomas's feet, pressing against each other, and soon fell asleep. Their breathing was even, and in sleep they quietly breathed contentedly. Thomas sat on a low stool holding a mug of hot tea in his hands. Luna lay nearby, resting her large head on outstretched paws, and gazed unblinkingly at the dancing tongues of flame. Thomas reached out and slowly, with deep tenderness, stroked the she-wolf on the thick coarse fur at the scruff of her neck. In response, she merely sighed softly and moved a little closer to his hand. The man surveyed the room. The fire in the hearth, the smell of fresh food, the peacefully sleeping wild animals at his feet. Illusions collapsed, phantoms of the past retreated, dissolving in the warmth of this evening. The space that had served him so long as a gloomy crypt of memories had transformed before his eyes. It had filled with meaning. Thomas realized a simple yet great truth. Now it was no longer simply a house. Now it was his family. That night, covered with a simple blanket under the sounds of quietly crackling logs and the measured breathing of his new friends, Thomas closed his eyes. For the first time in many, many years he sank into a deep restoring sleep in which there was no room for anxiety. The sleep of an absolutely happy and free man. Time possesses an amazing ability to heal wounds if one allows it to flow in the right direction. Several months flew by unnoticed, dissolving in the calm measured rhythm of the new life. The stormy rainy summer gave way to deep ringing Ural autumn. It was that magical time of year when nature, before plunging into a long winter sleep, decides to arrange its most lush and bright celebration. The air became incredibly transparent, especially fresh and cool. It was thickly filled with the sweet tart aroma of dry fallen leaves, damp tree bark, and clean rested earth. Thomas stood on the porch of his renewed wooden house and inhaled this air with full chest. Life around him had changed beyond recognition, as had he himself. His unusual family rescued on that fateful night on the rain-flooded shoulder had grown and strengthened. The pups had long ceased to be those clumsy, frightened, fluffy bundles he had hidden under his poncho. The white blizzard had stretched out, broadened in the shoulders, and turned into a large, amazingly beautiful young wolf. His light fur gleamed thickly in the sun and in every movement showed inexhaustible energy and youthful boldness. He was the first to explore new trails and the first to greet the morning sun joyfully. His brother, the dark silvery mist, had grown more graceful and thoughtful. He moved with astonishing grace, preferring first to study the situation carefully before acting. Mist always stayed a little behind, as if evaluating the world with his wise beyond his years' serious gaze. But Thomas's main pride was Luna. The she-wolf had fully recovered from the severe injury. Not a trace of pain remained from the deep wound on her thigh. Only a light, almost white scar stood out against her dark fur. That scar was no longer a symbol of weakness or defeat. Now it had become a kind of medal, a mark of pride and incredible resilience. Luna moved easily and confidently, filled with calm dignity and quiet, unshakable devotion. On this clear morning flooded with golden light, Thomas decided to take his pack to the summit of the highest hill rising above their forest valley. It was a long climb along winding paths strewn with rustling leaves through dense birch groves blazing in all shades of yellow and orange. On the way they met a man. It was Elias, a local beekeeper and forester living on the distant edge of the woods. Elias was a sturdy, stocky old man with incredibly kind, radiant eyes that hid in deep wrinkles when he smiled. His face was framed by a thick bushy beard, and from his thick canvas jacket always came a warm, soothing aroma of heather honey, beeswax, and dried medicinal herbs. Seeing Thomas accompanied by 3 adult wolves, the old man was not frightened and did not reach for a gun. He stopped at a respectful distance, leaning on his wooden staff, and smiled warmly. Luna merely twitched an ear in his direction, while the young wolves calmly sat on the path waiting for their master. "Good morning, Thomas," Elias said in a velvety, unhurried voice, nodding respectfully. "I see your forest friends have grown completely. Beautiful, smart beasts." "Good morning, Elias," Thomas answered, coming a little closer. "Yes, time flies quickly. They follow me like they are tied." The old beekeeper looked at Thomas's face attentively, paternally. "You know, it is not only they who have changed," he said quietly. "I remember you differently. You walk through this forest like a shadow, head lowered, closed off from the whole world. And now light has appeared in your eyes again. Your soul has returned home, son. Cherish this feeling. After saying goodbye to the wise old man Thomas and his pack continued their way upward. Elias's words echoed deeply in the man's heart. Indeed, he no longer felt like a stranger in this world. He was no longer a broken man deafened by grief. He was part of this nature, part of his new family. An hour of unhurried climbing later, they finally emerged onto the very summit of the hill. The trees parted, revealing a spacious sunlit glade covered with thick still summer green grass. From here, from this incredible height, a breathtaking panorama of the boundless valley opened. Thomas's gaze slid downward. The autumn forest spread beneath them like a huge blazing ocean of gold and copper. And far, far below, at the very bottom of the valley, the federal highway was barely visible. The very road that had once seemed to him the center of the universe, the source of endless noise, pain, and human indifference. Now from a bird's-eye view, this huge highway looked simply like a thin pale grey thread accidentally dropped by someone among the majesty of the forests. Tiny coloured dots of cars crawled slowly along it like ants. The loud roar of powerful engines, the whistle of tires, and the bustle no longer reached this height. The boundless majestic nature of the Urals had completely swallowed them, dissolved them in its calm. Thomas stood on the edge of the glade, breathing deeply. A powerful fresh autumn wind rushed onto the hilltop. It caressed yet insistently ruffled Thomas's hair touched by noble grey, cooled his face, and made the thick fabric of his jacket flap behind his back. Blizzard, intoxicated by the expanse and freedom, joyfully dashed from his place. He raced across the green grass in huge leaps, playing with the gusts of wind. Mist, more sedate but no less happy, joined the game, deftly dodging his brother and describing wide circles around the glade. Their silent play full of pure vital strength was the best proof that all the trials had not been in vain. Luna did not join the young one's games. She quietly approached Thomas and sat at his left leg. The she-wolf froze, straightening her back and directing her wise amber gaze into the distance like a faithful and unshakable guard protecting her friend's peace. Thomas slowly closed his eyes and spread his arms wide and freely to meet the oncoming air current. The wind sang. It whistled in the tall grass, rustled in the crowns of distant trees, flowed around the slopes of the hill in invisible powerful waves. Once long ago, in his previous gloomy life, such a hum of wind had evoked icy horror in his damaged consciousness. It had reminded him of the roar of catastrophe, the echo of a long irreparable loss. That sound had made him curl into a ball and seek shelter. But today, everything was different. His damaged hearing no longer distorted reality, no longer drew terrible pictures. The sound that now burst into his consciousness was incredibly pure, powerful, and healing. It was not a song of fear. It was the majestic solemn symphony of life itself, a hymn to absolute freedom. The wind washed his face, penetrated into the very depths of his soul, forever blowing out the last crumbs of regret, guilt, and long-standing longing. The pain he had carefully and painfully carried within himself for 5 long years finally released him, dissolving in the boundless blue sky above his head. Standing on the top of the world, surrounded by beings devoted to him, Thomas allowed himself simply to be. He absorbed every sound, every pure beat pulsing around life. In that very moment, under the rays of the autumn sun, the darkest and most terrible storm in his life forever dissipated, leaving behind only a clear, endless sky of freedom. Sometimes the greatest miracles in our lives come not with thunder and lightning, but in a quiet, barely perceptible call for help. The story of Thomas and his forest family reminds us that no matter how deeply our own scars are hidden, sincere compassion is capable of healing even the most tired heart. In our everyday bustle, among endless noise and cares, it is very easy to close off from the world and hide behind a wall of indifference. But it is precisely when we find in ourselves the strength to extend a helping hand to another living being that we actually save ourselves. Kindness and mercy are those very bright beacons that can lead us out of any life storm and give true freedom of spirit. May the Lord bless everyone who hears these words. Fill their homes with peace and their hearts with quiet joy and unconditional love. Grant them strength to overcome any life adversities and wisdom to notice those who need support. May there always be room in their lives for a bright miracle and soulful peace. If you share this bright prayer, write amen in the comments. If this story touched your soul, please put a like and share this video with family and friends so that there may be a little more warmth and hope in the world. Write in the comments which city you are from and what feelings this story evoked in you. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so as not to miss new kind and inspiring stories. Thank you for being with us. God keep you.